Very thankful for it. Okay, so we're going to talk now about ideas from a different perspective. We had a general orientation, and then in the last hour we looked at how to use the data for faculty evaluation. And now we're going to look at how to use idea data for assessment, program review, and accreditation. Okay? I think I'll turn this on. Yeah. So the plan for this session is to look at group summary reports, the aggregate data file, show you a picture of what that looks like, benchmarking reports, and we'll talk a little bit about accrediting guides. So we've already talked this morning about the four basic questions that the report answers, and by now you probably can articulate them yourself. Questions about how are students rating their learning, what are the contextual variables that are impacting those ratings, how do you compare, how do those scores compare to other groups, and what might be done for teaching improvement efforts. But all these questions focus on the individual faculty member and the individual course. What can I do to get better at what I'm doing? But when we move to the group summary reports, we shift the question from how did I do to how did we do. And that's why you can order these group summary reports, because it will take all of the data that you are providing on the individual report and aggregate. So we answer two questions with the group summary report. How did we do and how might we improve? In this session, we're going to focus on the first question, how did we do? And in the last session, we'll use our aggregate data to talk about faculty development, planning, and resource allocation, and using data to make decisions about how to help faculty improve. So the group summary report, there are different types of group summary reports. If you want, how many of you have never seen a group summary report? All right, you've all seen them. If you want to follow along, you should have your own with you. And pull that out. Or there's sample B in the back of the right-hand side of your folder. Okay. So you can order an institutional group summary report, which I think you do each semester. It probably goes to the Office of Institutional Research. Each department can order its own report. You can get a report for different types of courses, service courses, introductory level courses, major field courses. You can get reports for programs, whether it's your general studies program or an education program, teacher preparation program, or a business marketing program, whatever it may be. You can order a group summary report to get information about how students are perceiving their learning on a whole. So group summary reports help to address questions that are longitudinal. You can order these reports over time. Secondly, they answer questions that are contextual. And you'll see some of these as we go through them. Questions definitely that are curricular. What are we targeting? How are students reporting learning? What can we do to improve? Pedagogically, so they answer pedagogical questions. And they are focused on student learning because the whole idea of philosophy focuses on student learning. And so the group summary reports, by definition, can be useful for you for program review and accreditation because your accrediting bodies are so frequently asking you two questions. What do you want your students to learn? And how do you know that they learned it? And how are you using data to improve? How are you closing the loop? And we believe that IDEA provides one valuable source that you can add to other sources in triangulation of data as you create your reports for accreditation. Remember, you can add up to 20 items. Now let's think about this for a minute. If you want to add questions that pertain to, for instance, your QEP, which will probably be about critical thinking, you could use the items that are already on your instrument, number 11, covert learning objective, focuses on critical thinking. You also know which teaching methods are already associated with student progress on critical thinking, so you can use those. But let's say there's something that you want to get at that's particularly unique to critical thinking. I don't know, I'm just going to make this up off the top of my head, so it may not work, but maybe it's something to do with some use of technology in critical thinking. Well, then you'd need to add a question. It is not on the instrument. You want to get to some level of granularity. Maybe it's the conceptual framework for your NCAPE accreditation. Maybe it's some other question that you will need for your accreditation. The important thing is that when you want to get aggregate data, you have to make sure that you're using the same number for the item across the board. So, for instance, if you're using extra questions for institution-wide issues, then you need to make sure that number 49 on the form is always the same for everyone. So that then you can go back and aggregate the extra questions. Now 49 has meaning. If 49 is something about my textbook and something about group work and, oh yeah, you're asking about critical thinking or whatever, and then you aggregate it, obviously, it lacks meaning. Now, because of that, we think it's important for you to have conversations among yourselves with the assessment office, your institutional research office, and come to consensus, and come to agreement about what are our extra questions that are institutional, what numbers are they, and what are they going to be, if there are any. And then programmatic, perhaps. Anything for your professional accreditation, social work, education, whatever it may be, ABET for engineering, AACSB for business, whatever it may be. Do you have particular questions that aren't necessarily covered by the items that are already on the instrument? If so, you're going to want to put that on there. That's the example I gave from Loyola Chicago. They have 3 questions for the conceptual framework that they add on every survey. You would come to that agreement, and after the institutional items, they would be added. And then there would ostensibly be room for an instructor to add a couple questions or a few questions that he or she may want to add based on that particular course. So you start with your institution-wide questions, department-wide questions, program questions, and then course questions. But you have to be in agreement on what number is what. The other thing is, when you order your group summary report, you need to check a little box that says add the extra question. That's because if you don't check that box, we are assuming that the items don't match, and so aggregate data would be meaningless. But if the items do match, and you want the aggregation of those data, then just check the box and you get the extra. Local code is important. If you're using Idea Online, only your OCC, your on-campus coordinator, or your sub-OCC, the person who works with Tian Han, she's the OCC, will have access to this. But it's important for you to know about. It's a field where you can code the data for local purposes. So for instance, maybe you want to know how well your adjuncts are doing in your course, in your program. So you can select a certain code, A1 for all adjuncts. Maybe you want to know, we have some other examples here, I'll give you in a minute, but the important thing there is for you to be in agreement as an institution on what the codes mean. So you're all using the same code, and then you can get reports that would be reflective of the kind of data that you want to get. Here's some examples. This one comes from Benedictine University. They use the first column of the local code for delivery format, self-paced, lecture, studio, lab, seminar, online. Here's another example where more variables are used for each one. So 1 is day tenured, 2 is evening tenured, 3 is day tenure track, and so on and so forth. So then you could request, I want all the day courses, classes. So you would ask for code, local code. Give me a group summary report based on local code 1, 3, and 5. And you would get a report with all of your daytime classes. And so on and so forth. All your courses taught by adjuncts then would be, in that case, 5 and 6. So there's a lot of flexibility there for local code. It gives you a lot of latitude to think through what kinds of data you'd like to capture to use for accreditation reports. Okay, so now we're going to dip into the group summary report, and this is the first page. It always confuses me because this is the cover page, and then this is page 1. So I always think that's page 1 to page 2. But anyway, if you're like me, it seems like it should be page 2, but it's actually page 1. And what you see here is an important box on the first page. First thing you see is how many diagnostic forms are used. And in this example that's on the screen, this school was using short form, and so how many short form were used, the total. The number of excluded classes, so we talked about that this morning. They're excluded if they what? Didn't select any objectives, and then one other reason.
One person.
Only one responded. Okay, so in this case, 0 were excluded. The next important information is how many classes have a response rate below 65%. That's kind of like the benchmark area we look for, 65%. In this case, out of a group of 42, 2 of them are below. And then it gives you your average response rate. This is a pretty good one for this group, 85. We don't know that this is all online because it's on paper. And then the average class size. So some sample assessment questions that group summary reports can help to address are here. What are our faculty emphasizing? So you might know as a department head or a program director what should be emphasized. But when you get your group report, you'll actually see the percentage of courses that are targeting particular objectives. And then how the students rate learning on those objectives when they are selected as important or essential. How do our courses compare to others in the IDEA database, courses in terms of the course characteristics? Remember all of those characteristics items that you see the results for on page 2. You're going to now see these in aggregate form. How do our students compare with others, their self-rated characteristics, and what efforts can we make for improvement? And the last question is the one that we're going to focus on at the end of the day today, but we'll go through the report. So this is an example of how a school might think through some objectives that they may have. A lot of accrediting bodies call them student learning outcomes. You might think of an objective as the target. Sometimes when accrediting bodies call them student learning outcomes, they are referring to the end result. What's the end result that you have in mind? Sometimes they actually want to know what's the learning artifact, what's the outcome, what's the product. Typically, they want a well-stated objective, and what I'm showing you here is that you can list those on the left, the topics or the areas that are objectives or learning outcomes that have been given to you either by your institution for your general studies or your program or from your professional accrediting body. They might also be in the form of standards, as in NCAGE, and I would imagine social work and some of the others like that. And then you would just match up the objectives from IDEA, and then you would know how to track that in your aggregate data. So you would ask, are we targeting the student learning outcomes in the particular courses? And you might find a gap. So now page 2 shows you the percentage of classes that select each objective as important or essential. So they're grouped together. Either you selected it or you didn't select it. So they're relevant to the course. And this example on the screen happens to be from an English department. So you might find that important to know. First of all, note that objectives 1 and 2, basic cognitive background, it's a rather low percentage for being selected, but we might think, okay, these are writing courses, that kind of makes sense. Look at objective 8, which is communication and writing or orally, and you see that's pretty high. That makes sense. Objective 11 is critical thinking. And so now we see the national average is 49% of classes are selecting objective 11. 42% within this particular institution, and 28%. Now, you might say, well, that's fine. This particular group is focusing on, I don't know, basic writing skills or something like that. Or you might say, that's not fine. We need to make sure all our students in writing classes are focusing on critical thinking. I'm not making any value judgment. I'm just showing you how you can use the data to see what are faculty emphasizing. And keep in mind, the question isn't should they be emphasizing it or not, but rather, is it appropriate to this group? What is the group? Is it an English group? Is it the whole institution? Is it your program? And think about what is the group, and then are the selection, the percentage of times that the objectives are selected, does it seem appropriate to you?
Can I just
Sure.
must have been misunderstanding. Today, Mr. Carpenter, that was 81%.
I know, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
The Mr. Carpenter here is 81% for objective 11.
Thank you.
I wouldn't want anyone to live in thinking it was all 28%.
That's wonderful. This is a sample on the screen, and so the English department here is 81% for critical thinking. Kudos to you, that's great. Thanks for that clarification. Okay. So, another place to look at what you're emphasizing is on page 9. So you've got a sample report, either yours from your department or some other place. You can look at page 9 and you'll see what is on the screen here, section B, and it's called course emphases. Now all the data on page 9 come from the faculty information form. So now you see why we want you to complete those contextual items. Even though if you don't complete them, they will not have any kind of an impact on your individual report. If you do complete them and your faculty complete them, it will give you more data for purposes such as these. So here you're looking at what faculty say they are emphasizing in the class. So they've targeted writing, and here we see much. The percent indicating the amount required. 82% said there's a lot of writing being required. Critical thinking, 40% said much, 30% said some, 30% said none or little. And almost, it seems kind of like it matches up or what the other, what they said about in terms of selecting objectives. Now we turn to pages 5 and 6. And we see what the students say about these objectives. So you know how frequently they're being selected as important or essential. You know what the faculty are saying in terms of what they're emphasizing, the general types of learning, from page 9. And now we look at pages 5 and 6 to see what students are actually saying about their learning. And in this case, it's item number 1, gaining factual knowledge, 11 classes. It was targeted in 11 classes. And you can see here that this graph shows you at least 3.5 or higher, and that's probably about 75% of these classes. So you could look at objective 11 would be critical thinking. I don't have that actual report in front of me, but if you did, you would go right to critical thinking and see, well, what are the students saying? The faculty say that they are targeting it only 28%, and it's about split with their emphasis on page 9. Let's see what the students are saying. And they may be saying, you know, a low percentage of students saying that they're making substantial or exceptional progress. Now you have a full picture. Faculty aren't particularly targeting it. They don't see it as a big area of emphasis, and students are not saying they're making progress on it, by and large. So these are 3 ways to look at an item such as critical thinking. Now you turn to page 3, and you'll see at the top of the page a distribution of converted scores. Remember, the converted scores are the T-scores. And we did that because the learning objectives all have different average scores. Remember that, the different means. It's more challenging for students to make progress on critical thinking, for instance, than it is for them to make progress on gaining factual knowledge. And so we convert them. So we're using converted scores, but we're looking at the distribution of these converted scores, and the expected distribution for the top two rows, you see, much higher is 10 and higher is 20. So one thing I like to do is kind of do a quick look across the board and ask myself, do I see at least 30% there for those first two rows? And if I do, then I can have some sense of confidence that teaching effectiveness is taking place in this group as a whole. How are we doing as a whole? We are doing pretty well in this particular case on the screen in front of you, because we see at least 30%. You add up those two rows all the way across. That's one way you could do it. On the bottom, you've got your average scores that are your converted averages. I want to point out that the idea system is given to you across the board as the average score. 50 is the average score, but you'll see 51 once in a while. You know why that is? It's because we double weight the essential items, which pushes it up to 51 once in a while. So look at the bottom of page 3, and you'll see the percent of classes at or above the idea database average. So what we like to say here is, if your scores, your percent of classes fall at about 60% or higher of the ideas-centered average, that's an indication of effectiveness. You should feel good about that. Because it would be 60% would be over the average of the idea database. So that's the bottom of page 3. Now page 4, gives you the same thing, except it's now focused on comparing to this institution. So page 3, all your data in aggregate form are compared to the idea database as a whole. Page 2, you get the exact same kind of data, but now your comparison group is different, and it's to your institution. So now, one question I often get is, well, Shelley, what if we order an institutional report? So we've got an institutional report, and it's being compared to our institutional data. How do you do that? Well, the institutional report will be for a certain amount of time, usually a semester, sometimes a year. The institutional data, which would be the norm group, is the last 5 years of data. And those 12, 13. You don't quite have 5 years yet, so it'll be whatever years you started using in 2009. And then once you get 6 years, the oldest year drops off. And on September 1st of every year, we update our norms. Okay? Page 7 is my favorite page of the Group Summary Report, because it is the aggregate form of page 3. Page 3 of the individual report focuses on suggested action steps for improvement. Remember that? It's all based on that correlation study we looked at that showed the association between certain teaching methods and learning objectives. You want your students to make progress on these objectives. We know that these teaching methods are associated with student progress. And so we provide you with suggested action steps. So what you see here is, on the left-hand side of page 7, the list of teaching methods. And they are grouped by what we call teaching styles, which are stimulating student interest, fostering student collaboration, establishing rapport, encouraging student involvement, and structuring classroom experience. Then, in the middle, you see the number of classes for which these methods would be associated for student progress and objectives based on what was selected in those classes. And you see the average score given for the frequency of it and the standard deviation. Now, the bar graph that's on the far right works like this. What I would do is I look for the long dark bar, because that means it's a method that was used infrequently when it could have been useful, or at least associated, with student progress, for the objectives that were selected in the courses in this group. I also look at the number of classes, though, because if the number of classes says 3 or 4, that may mean that it's not that big of a deal for you. Because a lot of classes, and we're going to talk about this in the last section, of how to appropriate resources for faculty development based on your data. So it's based on the relationship of learning objectives to teaching methods. Now, page 8 looks at how students view their coursework demands. Remember, we looked at their self-rating of how, what the course was like, how much reading, amount of work, and that kind of thing. And here, this will give you some insights. I thought this was interesting. This is a real report, and 0% of the students in this report gave, with average, gave 4 or 5 to the difficulty of the subject matter. They're saying, this is not hard. Now, I'm not going to make a value judgment. If I were the program chair and this was the program report, it would give me pause. I'd sit down and have a conversation with faculty. I don't know. I don't know what you think about that, how you feel about that, but it's an interesting page. And it's interesting items for you to think about what students are saying about the requirements in the course, the amount of reading that they're doing, how hard they worked in the course, and so forth. So now here's an example of, let me just go back for a minute. I don't have a slide apparently for C, page 8, but it is one of my favorite items. And it's the aggregate of number 40. As a result of taking this course, I have more positive feelings towards this field of study. I think it can be very useful for courses that are leading to the major. You want students to enter into certain majors, or you're checking dispositions or what have you. I think number C, improved student attitude, can be useful for you. So now I'm just going to go through a sample here. What I did is I asked somebody at the Idea Center to pull up a sample. I don't know, this is from Jacksonville State, but I don't know which group summary report it is. I have no idea. Okay, so this is like a random sample from somewhere at Jacksonville State. Okay, so we would look at it, and then we're going to talk about aggregate data file benchmarking, and then we're going to go into groups again, and we're going to practice with the group summary report. So the first thing we see is there are 41 classes included in this group summary report. They were all using Diagnostic Form, which is great. And then we see how many were excluded. 34. That's a lot. So what happened probably? Probably they didn't have objectives set. Next thing we see is how many classes below 65%. And that's a lot. 38. 38 out of 41. And the average response rate is 43. So right away we know what our 2 big areas are. How to complete the faculty information form and how to work on improving the content. Right away, first box in the group summary report. We probably should stop right there and work on this. So we go on to page 2, and we look at the bottom of the page, and it shows the average number of objectives selected as important or essential. And we see 9.3. And what had we suggested? 3 to 5. So maybe this is going to inform us as we go through the report. Okay, now we're going to look at the top 2 rows. Like I said before, I look at 30%. I see 30% here. Here, and here, and here. It's not very high, but I think it's 30%. Now we're going to look for at least 60%. And I'm going to mention about the aggregate data. There's 2 different ways of thinking about the aggregate. I'm sorry, I mean adjusted scores in the aggregate data. Some people feel like the adjusted scores in the aggregate data don't make sense because you're adjusting for the individual characteristics of a course. So when you aggregate it, put it together, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There are some schools, however, that use only adjusted scores for all of their purposes, for promotion and tenure, for all of their decision making. And so, therefore, they want to continue to use adjusted scores even in the aggregate form. So the decision is yours. That's why we provide both. So here, we want to look for at least 60% or higher for these particular data points as compared to IDEA. And we see that they pretty much just barely make that 60 cutoff. If you look at the adjusted scores, they go down a little bit. And then compared to the institution, now what do you see? Don't quite see the 30%, do you? So something's falling out here. Comparing to the institution, so here we are now looking at the percent of classes at or above this institution's average. And we see here for progress on relevant objectives, which is what I said at the very beginning of the day today, is probably the most important single data point. You're going to start there. And we're not hitting the 60% there. So that might be a concern. Then we're going to look at some of the learning objectives, however, and look at here, gaining factual knowledge, if close to 100% of the students saying at least 3.5 or higher. So it's sort of an enigma here. Here's page 7. I apologize for the small print. It's kind of hard to get it all on the screen. But now you begin to see where some of the teaching methods are emerging as things that you can target to help this group of faculty to improve. And we're going to elaborate on that in the last session. 39 and 43, those are the two main predictors of adjusting the scores. So we can see what are students saying about their motivation and their work habits, and how do they compare to the institution and to the IDEA system. And so you see here that in terms of motivation, it's, the plus or minus 0.3, so it's pretty close, but if anything, it's a little lower than the institution, but it's right on with the IDEA system. And it's actually a little higher than, work habits are a little higher than the IDEA system. So the students in this group are saying we're working hard. Primary and secondary instructional approaches, 63% are lecture, 34% secondary approaches lecture. So there's a lot of lecture going on here, and that's, no value judgment there, I'm just pointing it out. So that's the end of looking at some of the group summary report data. Before we go into group work, I want to talk a little bit about the other sources of aggregate data. And then we'll just have hands-on practice with your own group report. I also have the sample there for you. So there's an aggregate data file I'd like to show you. I think I can pull it up easily. Pardon me, my back to you. Okay. So here you can see it's spreadsheets. And this file can come, if you only need to order it once, it can come to the Office of Institutional Research. But you have access to these data. These are yours. And you're able to plot them in SPSS or SAS or whatever you want and create all kinds of different types of reports. So all of your data are there. You may already order that, I don't know. So you can display your data differently by getting the aggregate data. You don't have to keep it the way we've done it. And you can display responses to different questions. We ask certain questions, and we provide you data for it. But you may have another question. It might relate to your QEP or something else. And so if you get your aggregate data, you can display it in different ways to show responses to different things. And here's an example of how one school has used their aggregate data. They wanted to look at their progress on relevant objective scores over time. And so you see the blue column is fall 2010, spring is 2011, fall is 2011. Red is spring 2011, green is fall 2011. And so you can look also how they did their bar graph below in terms of their progress on relevant objectives being much higher. So here's your frequency, and you can see sort of a bell curve, can't you? So they're displaying their data differently. This is interesting. This is excellence of teacher. And look what's dropping off. They don't have much falling into the much higher category on excellence of teacher. So that's something for them to explore. And they're looking at that over time. Excellence of course. This is the summary category. And you still see that much higher is kind of low. Now they're looking at the primary approaches and secondary approaches. And what are they doing? You see that lecture is very high, and lecture is still showing up down below. And again, I'm not making a value judgment that they might say, well, let's get a little more active learning here. Just showing you some ways that you can use the data. The instructor's reports on course emphases. What are we comparing, or what are we emphasizing? Here's writing, and then they're comparing it to communication. So it's a way of pairing two different types of emphases to see what are the faculty emphasizing. And then the instructor's reports on course emphasizing critical thinking and writing. So how does that compare? So the top would be critical thinking, and on the bottom is writing. So those are just some examples of how you can do your own thing, create your own graphs. And I imagine that once we go digital, that's going to be even more exciting for you to be able to manipulate your data and create graphs and so forth. So we also have something called benchmarking reports. And they're very useful for you. There are 3 different types of benchmarking reports. But let me just describe them first. For the trend reports, you can ask for comparison to 6 to 10 of your peers. I think that's true for your one-year benchmarking report as well. So you would get a list of our clients who are eligible. The eligibility requirement is based on their contribution to the data. So you have to have contributed a significant amount of data to the database to be eligible to be part of the peer group. So you would get that list of who's eligible, and then you would select 6 to 10 of those peers. And you would get data that would show how you did compared to your same Carnegie classification and the IDEA database. And on every one of those data points that you see in the individual report. So this one is progress on relevant objectives. The student is the unit of analysis rather than the course. In the group summary report, it's the course average. Here, we're talking about the student. So if you have a class of 100 students, that's going to be reflective of 100 students rather than just a class of 5 students. So if you're measuring a class of 5 students with a class of 100 students, would be the average of each class. But in this case, the student is the unit of analysis. And instead of averages, the percent of positive ratings is given, whether 4 or 5, substantial or exceptional progress. So in this case, you can see an example of how an institution has done compared to the national database, their Carnegie classification, to their peers. The peers would be the red line. The black line is this institution's own data. And they can see how they're doing compared to those different comparisons. You find out the number of classes that are included and the number of ratings provided by students. All of that's provided at the beginning of the report. Your response rates are given. National response rates in the Carnegie group, and so forth. Average number of objectives selected per class. So all this is interesting. We had a school that wanted to be compared to schools that were in the same, association, I guess. CCCU is an association of schools. And so they picked 10 schools and got the aggregate data and discovered they were selecting far fewer objectives than their peer group. It was an interesting opposite. And they were afraid to select objectives. And so they kind of adjusted that to saying, we need to be true to our course. We need to focus on, let's authenticate our objectives. And so you never know what you're going to see with these benchmarking reports, but it's interesting to look at it on different data points. That's just how the different scales look. Students' perceptions of their gen ed will show up here. This one is first-year students and sophomores seeking to develop background needed for their specialization. Instructional objectives that are used versus comparison groups, and the student self-report on learning. So here's an example of something that was interesting. This particular school found that on Idea Objective Learning 3, the faculty learning to apply course material to improve thinking, problem solving, and decisions, the faculty were not rating that as important over the years as much as their peer group, the Carnegie classification, or the national. That was kind of an eye-opener for them. Same thing for Objective 8, which is writing and speaking. They were selecting it far fewer times than their comparison groups. Teaching methods are also reported in the benchmarking report. And in this case, you can see that they're fostering student collaboration, encouraging student involvement. Those teaching styles were actually lower here than their comparison group. So those different types of information you can get from the benchmarking report. So when you use aggregate data for assessment, you can think about what are your university student learning outcomes. What are your goals for your general studies, your courses in the major, and your graduate programs? And then what are the objectives for each course? And then you can collect group reports that will help you identify how you have been doing on the group level for each of those different segments. We do have accreditation guides. One is for SACs, and you're in SACs, right? Yes, you're in SACs. And I think that's in your folder, if I'm not mistaken. Should be. Yes. Looks like I have middle states. I don't know why. Do you have middle states put in your folder? I hope you got SACs. You know, it should be on your left side of your folder. You have middle states? That's not going to help you. Don't use middle states. SACs is on our website. There's two more, one for NCATE and one for KCRAP. So these are guides that show you how to use, to the left-hand side, in the back of the left-hand side. How to use idea data for accreditation purposes. My goal in creating the one for NCATE and KCRAP was to really create a prototype. So that if you're doing it for ABET, you're doing it for social work, you're doing it for, what's the one for music? NASA, you're doing NASA, and so on and so forth. You could probably read through this guide that I did for NCATE and KCRAP and see how to extrapolate. If I can get to it, I'll write those other ones as well, but I think it's a pretty good model for you to follow when you are collecting your aggregate data, idea data for your professional accrediting needs. There's NCATE, KCRAP. Okay, so before we go into practice, I want to ask if you have any questions about the group summary report, the aggregate data file, the benchmarking, or accrediting guide. What we're going to do now is the same thing we did before. So now, in your packet, instead of the yellow form, we're going to pull out the blue paper. The blue handout has guided questions for interpreting group summary reports. And then there is a sample group summary report that has questions in it that match up to these questions. I mean, numbers that match up to these questions. You can also pull out your own group summary report. I know Tian was helpful in helping you get reports. So you have those. I think that might be more valuable for you. You look at where the number is on the sample, where the red number is, and then look on your report. You follow me? So look where the number is on the red report, or red number, and then look on your report, and really spend time on your report for analysis. I think that's going to yield the most valuable information for you today. So if there's no specific question, I'll let you get started in your groups, and I'll come around and talk to somebody. Okay, let's come together. Sounds like a uniform. How do we all know this? It says something about our age. Okay. Let's hear some comments or questions about your. helpful for you in the future?
Yeah, very much.
Good. And I had some really interesting questions as I went around the room. Some of them were challenging me. I had to think really hard, so I appreciate that. So let's just debrief a little bit. What did you find that's new? What, we have a few minutes here, so before we break, what questions do you still have? Or let's do a CAC. What was the most interesting thing you learned about group summary reports?
As far as we're concerned, secondary, look like we don't meet the requirements of the institution.
In what way? Elaborate a little bit.
Yeah.
That's Charlie, right?
Yes, and we may have used 4 of the criteria, and the university used 7. That kind of stuff. But when you go take ours versus idea, we're right on.
When you say criteria, you mean objectives?
Number of objectives.
Number of
Okay, number of objectives. Okay, okay. So, and your institution is high.
Yes.
We'd like to see that come down. Probably.
We're doing good and they're not.
That's right. Make you feel good, huh? Okay, that was an interesting point. Any other interesting things that you learned or insights that you may have gleaned from your own departmental group summary report? Yeah.
Okay, when we were looking at page 9 in primary and secondary structural approaches, one interesting thing.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can you just a little bit louder?
Okay, yeah. One of the interesting things for us, we're in social work and we're a professional degree program, of course, and so we had on page 9, primary and secondary structural approaches, we thought it was interesting that we had 0 as primary teaching method and 0 secondary, and that's called field. So we're wondering if maybe as a department we need to look at that as how are we labeling it, and what do we need to instruct our faculty and students for? Because we're not getting a good result on this. We don't know if the instructors are looking at it as a seminar or skill activity, because there's some percentages there. But we're combining 2 disciplines, sociology and social work. So, you see?
Okay, so a couple of things I'll say about that. One is on the directions the faculty hands out, that beige 4-page thing. Each of these terms is defined. How IDEA is using the word seminar and so on and so forth. So that might be a touchstone for you to use as a conversation piece with your faculty. And then secondly, if you want to separate your data, I don't know how many courses you've got, but you might want to consider ordering a group summary report for each and see how they compare. But that's a thought. Okay, good thoughts. Somebody else? Yes. Nice and loud.
Linda, I was looking at the secondary. We looked at what the faculty said was important and then what the students identified as important. And it was really interesting. A lot of them matched up pretty well, but some of them, the faculty might have said, had a low percentage of saying this is really important. But then the students, a huge percentage of the students said it was important.
Okay, and in terms of student characteristics at the back page that we
No, we were looking at the comparing page 2 with pages 5 and 6.
Okay, so 5 and 6, they're telling you how much progress they've made on learning.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're saying 3.5, 3.75, 4.0 is averages, and so page 2 shows you how frequently faculty are selecting it as important or essential. Pages 5 and 6 are a great companion to check, like you said. Okay, we said it's really important. Now they're saying, nah, they didn't make that much progress, or whatever.
We had quite a few where we didn't say it was important, but like almost all of them were making progress.
Okay, let me say another point about it.
How does that work?
Page 5 and 6 shows you how students rated their learning on those objectives when they were selected as important or essential. So that's a key point.
Okay.
So all of page 5 and 6 demonstrates student progress on the objectives when they were selected as important or essential. We're not giving you data in this group summary report based on something you said it's not important. So I'm glad you brought that up. Good question. Another one. Yeah.
We were looking at curriculum and instruction, and so we were little bit surprised under selecting the important and essential objectives at 3 of the findings. Objective 2, learning fundamental principles, generalizations, and theories. Some of our classes are heavy on theory, and yet only 69% of our faculty chose that.
Okay.
So we have a question about that. And then we also had a question, or I had a question about objective 8, developing skill and expressing myself orally or in writing. Well, most of teaching is an oral expression. And, some written expression too, of course, but only 52% of our faculty kind of recognize that. So when you think about that and how faculty should be modeling and getting students to work on that and really build that skill, that seems a little bit low. And then the last one was objective 11, the critical thinking one. So I looked at that one first off, and only 54% of our faculty chose it, and yet getting our students to think critically is one of the main things we're trying to do all the time, because of course we want them to get their students to think critically. So that kind of suggests that we may not be valuing that right, or maybe we don't understand it.
Or how to do it. And so what I would suggest to you is to think about those 3 questions and turn them into implementing strategies. So, is it a significant part of the course? That's the first question. You sit down and talk to your faculty. To what extent is developing critical thinking in our students a significant part of this course? Secondly, you, the teacher, you are doing something significant to help your students develop critical thinking. So now as a faculty, you say, what is it that we're doing in this course to help our students develop critical thinking? And then thirdly, does it have an impact on the students' grades? In what way? Where does it show up in the rubric? And so now you've got concrete ways to back up into a workshop to help your faculty actually develop that curriculum in a way that will really target critical thinking. Very good insight. Somebody else?
Yeah, page 9, if you have it with you.
Page 9. I think they know it.
It seems to be a different interpretation. What our faculty would call a seminar would be different from what students would look like, what perceived to be a seminar.
Well, we're going to keep in mind, first, let me interrupt you if you don't mind. All of the results on page 9 come from the faculty information form. So these are not student responses at all. These are faculty responses.
Why do we have differences here in terms of interpretation?
Faculty have differences, agreed. And so that's why we have the faculty directions to faculty handout with the description of how we are using the word seminar. And so you as faculty can have conversations about that in your department meetings. Good point. See, these are bringing up really important issues about the GSR, where the data come from, and how to use the data. Other questions? Yeah.
This is actually a question. On page 7, the number of classes included in the teaching methods and style. For A, we had 51 for all of those, but in some of the others, B, C, D, and E, those numbers changed. Can you explain why or how that happened, how those were calculated?
It has to do with the number of classes in which that objective was selected as an important reason.
So that's
it.
clearly it. Okay. Thank you.
And we're going to talk about that in the next session.
We did really well in how frequently we use these methods. I'll report that.
Okay, I'm cognizant of the time. If you have any more burning questions, I'll take them. Otherwise, we'll take a break, come back, and look at our last